Okay, so I'm about to make some of you really mad. Those of you that consider yourselves fiscal conservatives, that is. So if you care where your tax dollars go and what they go for, well, stand by. Because for the next few minutes, I want to talk about what liberal big government views on money are like. Your money to be exact. Money that taxpayers have contributed to the cause, right? Money that on one hand is held against us and used sometimes to coerce enforcement of an agenda, while at the same time, our tax dollars are used and abused without accountability at times by the same ones who just tried to coerce our behavior with it. It's an odd measure of fiscal hypocrisy. But first, let me do this. Let me back up a minute, set the stage by telling you a story. Actually, it's a memory, a personal memory, one that maybe some of y'all can relate to. See, when I was a kid, roughly middle school age, my dad was an Army officer. We were stationed in London, England. One summer, it was worked out that I could come back to the States to visit family and stay for the summer. Sounds good, right? So as a 12 or 13-year-old kid, I boarded the plane by myself and flew from London's Heathrow International to LaGuardia and from there to Birmingham, Alabama. Now, I've had enough adventures as a well-traveled adult moving around in crowded airports. But I look back now and I cannot believe that I was set loose as a middle schooler to find my way across international waters with changeovers in major airports. All I knew to do was to get off in LaGuardia, find an information booth, ask how to get my next gate. Anyway, there I was, probably looking lost as a coot, walking the terminals, staring up at signs, and all of a sudden someone grabbed my arm. And I looked over and there was this booth full of, basically hippies wearing robes. So back then, it was actually common for the airports to allow special interest groups to set up shop in small booths, try to solicit travelers as they walked by. I kid you not, it was a four-sided waist-high square about 10 by 10, and there were about a half a dozen Moonies there. For those who don't remember, that's a cult that was led by the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. And they were all the rage back in the 60s and 70s. And one of them had this unsuspecting teenager traveling alone, holding him by the arm. I didn't know what she wanted, but man, she was into it, telling me all the amazing things their cult did and how she could sell me some of their beautifully decorated books. This went on for like a good 10 minutes without me even knowing what to do. All I knew was I had to get to a gate somewhere, and this adult had me by the arm and was telling me why it was important for me to contribute. Here's the end result. As a kid, this grown woman who should have known better finally let go of my arm when I finally handed her a $20 bill. Me thinking at the time I had just done something good, I guess. I was glad to be free of her. Maybe I'd done a good thing, because I gave to some charity or something. I didn't know what they were about. Also knowing that I didn't have time to understand it and nobody was there to explain it, and she was basically holding me hostage. To say that my parents were upset later, not at me, is an understatement. Well, let me tell you, what I just described is what liberals try to do to us every day. I'm not kidding. It's as if we're all the unwitting traveler and the liberals in D.C. are a bunch of money-grubbing Moonies with an agenda. If you'll do what we say, we'll let go of your arm. So we give them our money, and they make promises. But in the end, what they've really done is injected themselves further into our lives. Okay, so I know I'm sounding a bit more strident than usual, but it's only because of several stories from the headlines that gave me specific cause to say these things. You see, I'm not a government hater. I'm not. I don't cotton to the notion that just because someone's an elected official or works for the government that they are automatically corrupt. But when I see specific evidence of arm grabbing, then yes, I can get pretty wound up. So here's the thing. We all saw over the last 4 years how the Biden administration doubled down on their efforts to remake society, using the whole of government approach. It's as if they had a sense of desperation, like they knew they had to get it all done before the first term ran out. Well, in the course of doing so, they looked around for any place in which the unwitting taxpayer may feel trapped and have no choice but to yield to their agenda. Kind of like a kid traveling by himself dealing with money-grubbing Moonies. Case in point number 1. Did you know that federal funds for free and reduced lunches to underprivileged children in public schools have been held hostage to a woke agenda? You heard me. The Biden Department of Agriculture. Believe it or not, knowing full well that the states have become dependent on funding to help feed underprivileged children who might not otherwise get a full meal at home, those children were then targeted by the Biden administration for the loss of funds. In other words, the Biden administration had an agenda, and if you did not do what they wanted, they would withhold the funds to feed poor kids. Funds for those meals that kids relied on. unless states would adopt the Biden administration's rules and policies related to sexual orientation and gender identity. I kid you not. It was all a part of the effort to force a redirection on the gender wars. In new policy guidance, the USDA, which is the agency that's responsible for food security, they announced that schools must accept this new policy of mandating that transgender use of bathrooms and other such nonsense be accepted. If not, then the withholding of funds to any entity that distributes food aid, like baby formula, school lunches, community food banks, that the withholding of funds could follow. Fox News called it food security blackmail. All right, case in point number 2. The Heritage Foundation identified a new regulation that was buried deep inside the 1,036-page renewed Medicare regulations that were promulgated by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They found it back in 2022. CMS, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, apparently had what is being referred to as the new anti-racism rule. It's a requirement that any medical provider who treats Medicare patients, which is a lot of them, must create and implement an anti-racism plan. A plan that must include target goals and milestones to prevent and address racism and provide ongoing anti-racism training in order to best identify the implicit biases that the Biden administration is just so sure must exist in our healthcare arena. So what we have now is the government inserting itself into the actual business practices of medical providers and demanding that they acquiesce to their systemic biases and privileges that we just know are there, basically holding the doctors by the arm till they give in. Case in point number 3. Oh yeah, there's a lot of them. Case in point number 3. Do you remember the massive infrastructure spending bill, $1.2 trillion? Do you remember that one? Taxpayer dollars, by the way. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, he announced a strong arming of states and local governments to spend those infrastructure dollars on progressive pet projects, things like climate-resilient public transit, bike paths, mandating that old roads be repaired before new ones are built, regardless of what the needs of the locals really were. Buttigieg's leadership has even resulted most recently in threats to state governments of the loss of transportation dollars unless they prioritize matters related to pedestrians and bicyclists. All of this despite the fact that the express language of the spending bill actually prevents such monetary coercion. But once they've got the states being held by the arm, they feel like they can do what they want to do. Look, what we've been seeing is the most advanced case of the weaponization of money in perhaps, ever. Most folks never see it. Those that do are too often fearful that if they don't comply, they're going to be at a loss. That's why you hear about some schools, private schools and colleges now deciding they will take no federal funds because they don't want to be dictated to. The federal government is known for adding stringers. But rarely have we seen it at such a blatant, progressive, agenda-driven level. Elected officials and bureaucrats who would stoop to this level of revenue-based coercion, they're no better than Moonies in an airport grubbing money off of unsuspected little travelers. It's the weaponization of money. It's just plain wrong. But is the federal government, though, as careful with our tax dollars when they conduct business? If you're going to mandate behaviors and place regulatory burdens and withhold funds if we don't behave, it must mean that's because you're really responsible and you're an entity who leads by example, right? Well, as a matter of unmitigated fiscal hypocrisy, the same government that demands we conform to a liberal agenda or lose the use of funds, they don't have the accountability of many of the funds we even send them. Which brings me to the flip side of this discussion and the recent reports about the Pentagon. You see, there's a double standard out there, in case you hadn't noticed. We've seen it time and again. The little guy just takes it right on the chin, while the standards appear different if you know the right folks, work the right angles, or toe the right lines. Case in point, the Pentagon just failed a major annual audit. Again, for the 7th time. 7th time. And based on my own personal experience, I find that all the more galling. I say personal experience because, down at the grassroots level, 20 years ago, hard to believe, but 20 years ago, I came home from my second tour overseas and I was reassigned from being a team leader to the position of headquarters company commander. Any of you who've ever commanded an HHC, you know that one of the things that suddenly falls into your lap is personal responsibility for the largest property book among all your peers. All the ash and the trash, all the excess gear, all the massive end items that make up your property book, they're all assigned to your signature. It's kind of daunting. Depending on what kind of unit you're in, the inventory can be huge. So there I was as the newly minted HHC commander for my battalion. But I had learned as a young lieutenant, you never sign for it until you can touch it. You don't gloss over the change of command inventories, because if something you signed for isn't really there, well, later on when they discover it's missing, guess who has to pay for it? Yep, the guy who said it was there. So I took command, and then I made the date to inspect everything, and I mean everything. If there was a toolkit, I wanted to see every tool. If there was a weapon, I wanted to see the cleaning kit that went with it. Extra IBA, uniforms and supply, every boot, brush, and bale of wire. Lottie-dottie, everybody show me your stuff, or at least show me your sub-hand receipts, so I know who has it in their possession right then and there. Now, at the time, I was in a civil affairs battalion. There were 2 line companies and 1 HHC. And we all changed commands at roughly the same time. So my peers, the other 2 commanders, they did like a handshake, backslap with their buddies, signed the papers, and went to dinner. Not me, man. I did mine from stem to stern. You see, that unit, that same battalion, in just 5 years had done 3 deployments. Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. That's 3 out of 5 years totally mobilized with gear traveling all over the world. I knew there were shortfalls. I wasn't going to tote them on my books, and I was right. I came up, I kid you not, I came up with over $150,000 worth of missing gear and equipment, and I would not sign for it. I mean, some of it was explainable. 3 years in hostile fire zones, lateral transfers of equipment to other gaining units, people coming and going, paperwork didn't follow. It's madness, I get that. But some of it was just poor accountability by the people who went before me. And my battalion commander, when I told him, he was apoplectic. He wanted those inventories signed off on. He told me I had to get them turned in, but I told him I could not sign for what was not there, but that I would report the losses on what was known in the Army as a flipple. A flipple. You see, at the lower level, when we have taxpayer purchased equipment and something's missing and you don't know where it is, you actually have to be held accountable. You sign what's called a financial liability investigation of property loss, a flipple. It's a process used by the Army to determine if somebody is financially responsible for the loss, the damage, the destruction of government property. Basically, it's a report of everything you can't find. And it requires an investigation, and it can get ugly in a hurry. And I'm going to tell you right now, you know what happens? And I've seen it happen. Something's missing, the Army wants their blood. They're going to take it out of your paycheck. Yes, I have seen that happen. Well, my commander finally realized I was right. But then he turned to the other 2 commanders, and when he realized they had not been thorough, he made them go back and redo their inventories, and lo and behold, they came up with massive shortfalls and more flipples. It was awful. I mean, y'all, it was awful, but it was right. It was the right thing to do. It was the way it's supposed to be handled. So we ran it up the chain to brigade, and brigade freaked out, and they ran it up the chain to CA command. They freaked out, and they ran it all the way up to Fort Bragg to Civil Affairs PSYOPs command, the use of KPOC. The powers that be then passed their own freak out back downhill and required that every single civil affairs battalion in the entire Army had to stop what they were doing and conduct a line-by-line inventory of their property books. And man, the flipples started rolling in. I like to say, I handed in my report and I shut down a whole major Army command overnight. But see, the freak out was warranted. These were millions of dollars of military equipment that were missing and unaccounted for. And it was not always about negligence, but some of it was. Some was just poor accounting. Some was lackadaisical inventories. But these are taxpayer-funded items. And they will break, and they will be destroyed, and they will be stolen, they'll be lost, they'll be blown up in a war zone. But at the very least, we owe the taxpayers something more than just shrugging our shoulders, or doing a handshake and a backslap and signing the papers and pretending it's still there. But see, that's the way they treat us at the lower level in the ranks. But apparently, the Pentagon brass can get away with it. Because of the 28 reporting entities within the Pentagon force structure that got audited most recently, 15 of them received what is known as a disclaimer of opinion. That's a fancy phrase that means the inspectors were not even given enough information to determine why there were shortages and missing items that were not being accountable. What? Yes. 15 of the departments in the Pentagon's audited sections got disclaimers of opinion, which means that nobody even knew what the paperwork was to explain the missing stuff. At the lower level, we would have been run out on a rail had our careers, just completely auctioned off for what they could get out of us. Pentagon Comptroller, though, Michael McCord, he said, significant work remains and challenges lie ahead, but our annual audit continues to be a catalyst for department-wide financial management reform, resulting in greater financial accountability, integrity, transparency, and better supported warfighters. Blah, 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 blah. A catalyst, he says. Well, I hope so, because at the unit level, we were not allowed to have deficiencies. We shut down training to locate the smallest of end items. Y'all, I was in a unit once that had one M16 rifle stolen, which is a big deal. Just one M16 rifle, automatic weapon, I get it, it's a big deal. But everything shut down. The authorities were called in. Every vehicle, every footlocker, every nook and cranny was searched. It was a big, hairy deal. But the Pentagon, they can lose or abandon $1 billion worth of equipment in Afghanistan and shrug their shoulders when the Taliban uses it in their parades. So comedian and sometimes liberal pundit Jon Stewart, he interviewed Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks recently about this very thing. The interview was on C-SPAN. She tried to laugh it off at first, and I kid you not, she actually tried to laugh. She actually giggled and said, oh, no, but to his credit, he wouldn't let her just giggle, and he began to hold her feet to the fire. In Jon Stewart's words, he said, most people would consider that failure of an audit waste, fraud, and abuse. So our current Deputy Defense Secretary suddenly realized this was turning into a serious conversation. She jumped in with, well, I'm trying to understand where we're going here. I mean, other than the dollars, does it really bother you? Giggle, giggle. She actually laughed again. And then she went on to deflect further by claiming that the audits and waste, fraud, and abuse, those two things are not necessarily always the same thing. Okay. You're going to go with that? Really? She tried to wrap it up with some form of conclusion by claiming that just because we can't put our hands on something or know that something went from here to there does not mean that there was waste, fraud, and abuse. Okay, well, let's parse that a bit, because I don't think that would fly in a court of law. I don't think that would fly down at the lower level of the troops, and I certainly don't think it should fly with the taxpayers. There is a fraud element that does indicate deliberate action, waste, fraud, and abuse, I get it, but the waste and abuse are still concerns. And if you can't find $824 billion worth of stuff that the taxpayers paid for, then maybe, just maybe, there's a smidge of waste and abuse, mixed with occasional fraud. And if you don't like the idea of it being couched as a criminal act, at the very least realize that mere negligence would still get a lowly company commander like me fired for the same behavior. In a court of law, negligence is also actionable. Look, there's a reason why Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are being tapped to review government waste, because we have a great deal of waste in our government. We can't continue to fund transgender dance clubs in Bangladesh and pour money into tourism for Egypt and build bridges to nowhere in Alaska. We also can't continue to tell the troops in our great military that their personal accountability of weapons and equipment is so important that they could be punished under the Uniform Code of Military Justice for failing to properly account for their items, while at the same time allowing the leadership of the DoD to go on an interview and laugh and shrug and try to say that losing billions of dollars in military equipment and supplies and finances is not equal to waste, fraud, and abuse. Well, I got news. It just is. It just is. All day long. So we cannot have a two-tiered layer of accountability where the little guy takes it on the chin while the big guy laughs on C-SPAN and earns a big retirement bonus. There's an old saying, you cannot expect what you don't inspect, and I'm going to believe right now that the Pentagon should expect to be inspected in the next few years. But the bottom line for this whole conversation is, the weaponization of money is wrong. Coercion is coercion, whether it's committed by organized crime or the government. And if the government's going to grab us by the arm and take our dollars unless we comply with their agenda, well, shouldn't we also then be allowed some reciprocal ability to call for accountability on their spending? It's only right. But unfortunately, it's too often about the Benjamins and less about the good government. That's my philosophy.